The rain had been falling for hours, but it wasn't the kind of rain that washed anything clean. No, this was the kind of rain that turned to ice the second it kissed the cold asphalt. I'd been driving my rig for over a decade, and I'd seen my share of bad weather, but this was something else. The kind of night that made you question every life choice that led you to being alone on a desolate stretch of highway, gripping a steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping you alive. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Chicago to Denver, and the weather report had promised light rain, not this icy hell. My wipers were working overtime, slapping back and forth like a metronome, but they could barely keep up. The road was a mirror, reflecting the dull glow of my headlights, and the tires hummed nervously beneath me. I kept my speed down, barely crawling along at 40 miles per hour, but even that felt too fast. One wrong move, and I'd be sliding into the ditch, or worse, into oncoming traffic. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of the storm. Breaker, breaker, this is Big Mike. Anybody out there on I-80? Over. I grabbed the mic. This is Hank. I'm out here, Mike. What's your 20? Over. Just past mile marker 114. This ice is no joke, brother. You be careful out there. Over. Copy that, I said, setting the mic back in its cradle. Big Mike was a good guy, a veteran driver like me. If he was nervous, that meant the roads were worse than I thought. I was about to check my GPS when I saw them, headlights in my rearview mirror. They were coming up fast, too fast for conditions like this. I squinted, trying to make out the vehicle. It was a pickup truck, maybe a Ford, and it was weaving all over the road. My gut tightened. Drunk driver, maybe? Or just some idiot who thought four-wheel drive made him invincible? The pickup closed the distance in seconds, riding my tail like it was trying to push me off the road. I tapped my brakes, hoping the idiot would back off, but he didn't. Instead, he swerved into the oncoming lane and gunned it, pulling up alongside me. I glanced over, and that's when I saw him. The driver was a man, maybe in his 30s, with wild eyes and a face twisted in anger. He was yelling something, but I couldn't hear him over the roar of the engines and the pounding rain. Then I saw the gun. My heart skipped a beat. He was waving it around like a madman, pointing it at me, then at the road, then back at me. I didn't know what he wanted, money, my load, or just to scare the hell out of me, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I hit the gas, praying the tires would find traction on the icy road. The rig lurched forward, and for a moment I thought I had him. But the pickup was faster, and the guy was determined. He stayed right beside me, screaming and waving that gun like a lunatic. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the kind of desperation that made people do stupid, dangerous things. Come on, I muttered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road ahead was a straight shot, but I knew there was a curve coming up, a sharp one. If I could make it there, maybe I could lose him. The pickup's engine roared as the guy floored it, pulling ahead of me. For a second, I thought he was going to cut me off, but then he did something even crazier. He swerved in front of me, slamming on his brakes. I stomped on the brake pedal, but the ice had other plans. The rig started to skid, the trailer fishtailing behind me. I fought to keep it under control, but it was no use. The world spun in slow motion as the rig slid sideways, the tires screaming in protest. I braced for impact, certain I was about to crash. But then somehow the rig straightened out. I don't know how I managed it, pure instinct maybe, or dumb luck, but I was back in control. The pickup, though, wasn't so lucky. The guy had overcorrected, and his truck spun out, sliding off the road and into the ditch. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that lunatic as I could. The rain kept falling, the wipers kept slapping, and the road kept stretching out ahead of me, endless and dark. It wasn't until I reached the next truck stop that I finally pulled over. My hands were still trembling as I shut off the engine and climbed out of the cab. The air was cold and sharp, and the rain had turned to a fine, icy mist. I leaned against the rig, taking deep breaths, trying to steady my nerves. Inside the truck stop, I ordered a cup of coffee and found a seat by the window. The place was quiet, just a few other drivers scattered around, lost in their own thoughts. I sipped the coffee, letting the warmth seep into my bones, and replayed the night's events in my mind. I didn't know what had driven that guy to pull a gun on me, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I was alive, and my rig was in one piece. That was enough. As I sat there, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the skills that had kept me alive, for the rig that had held together, and for the simple fact that I'd made it through the night. The road was a dangerous place, especially in weather like this, but it was also a place of freedom, of solitude, of endless possibilities. And as long as I had the wheel in my hands and the open road ahead of me, I knew I'd be okay. I finished my coffee, tossed the cup in the trash, and headed back to my rig. The rain was still falling, but it didn't seem so menacing now. I climbed into the cab, fired up the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and wet and glistening with ice, but I wasn't afraid. I was a trucker, and this was my life. And no matter what the road threw at me, I'd keep on driving. The icy rain had been falling for hours, a relentless barrage that turned the highway into a shimmering black mirror. My windshield wipers worked overtime, struggling to keep up with the freezing deluge. The radio crackled with static, the only station I could pick up playing some old country tune that barely cut through the hum of my rig's engine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as I guided my 18-wheeler down the slick, desolate stretch of I-80. I'd been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, and the fatigue was starting to creep in. My eyes felt heavy, and the endless white lines on the road seemed to blur together. I knew I needed to pull over soon, but the next truck stop was still a good 50 miles away. The storm had other plans, though. It wasn't just rain, it was ice, coating everything in a thin, treacherous layer. One wrong move, and I'd be in a ditch. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure was just a shadow in the distance, barely visible through the icy haze. But as I got closer, the shape became clearer. A man, standing on the side of the road, thumb out, a hitchhiker. In this weather, I shook my head, muttering to myself, "No way, buddy, not tonight." But as I passed him, something made me glance in my rearview mirror. He was dressed in an old-fashioned military uniform, the kind you'd see in World War II photos. The rain didn't seem to touch him. His clothes were dry, and he stood perfectly still, his hands still raised. My stomach twisted. Something about him wasn't right. I kept driving, telling myself it was just the fatigue messing with my head. But a few miles down the road, there he was again. Same guy, same uniform, same stance. My heart skipped a beat. How the hell had he gotten ahead of me? I hadn't passed any exits or side roads. I slowed down, squinting through the rain. He turned his head, looking right at me, and for a split second, our eyes met. His face was pale, almost ghostly, but his eyes, they were full of something I couldn't quite place. Sadness? Desperation? I don't know what came over me, but I hit the brakes. The truck skidded slightly on the icy road, but I managed to bring it to a stop. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, staring at the soldier in my side mirror. He started walking toward the truck, his movements slow and deliberate. I rolled down the window, the cold air biting at my face. "You okay, buddy?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost like a whisper. "I need a ride." I hesitated. Everything in me was screaming to drive away, to leave this strange man behind. But there was something in his voice, something that tugged at me. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just up the road," he said. "I won't be any trouble." I sighed, glancing at the empty highway ahead. "All right, hop in, but make it quick. This weather's no joke." He nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. As he settled in, I couldn't help but notice how cold the cab suddenly felt. I turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The soldier sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His uniform was immaculate, not a single crease or stain, despite the weather, and he still didn't seem wet. "Name's Jack," I said, trying to break the tension. "What's yours?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, like he was remembering something from a long time ago. Thomas, he said. Private Thomas Harlow. Well, Thomas, what's a soldier like you doing out here in this mess? He was silent for a long time. Just when I thought he wasn't going to answer, he said, I'm trying to get home. There was something about the way he said it that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't press him further. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the hum of the engine. The storm seemed to be getting worse, the rain turning to sleet, the road becoming even more treacherous. I was starting to regret picking him up. About 20 minutes later, Thomas suddenly sat up straight, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Stop here, he said. I frowned. Here? There's nothing out there. Please, he said, his voice urgent. I need to get out here. I didn't argue. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the icy gravel. Thomas opened the door and stepped out, turning to look at me one last time. Thank you, Jack, he said. You're a good man. Before I could respond, he closed the door and walked off into the storm. I watched him go, my heart racing. He disappeared into the icy rain, and just like that, he was gone. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I needed to get out of there. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. But there was no sign of Thomas. The rest of the drive was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he'd looked at me, about the cold that had settled in the cab. By the time I reached the truck stop, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I parked the rig and headed inside, desperate for a hot cup of coffee and some human interaction. The diner was nearly empty, just a few truckers scattered around nursing their coffees. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup, my hands still trembling. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, noticed my state and gave me a concerned look. You okay, hon? She asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a laugh, though it came out more like a croak. Just a long night, I said. Bad weather, you know. She nodded sympathetically and poured my coffee. As I sipped it, trying to warm up, I noticed an old photo on the wall behind the counter. It was a black and white picture of a group of soldiers standing in front of a barracks. My heart nearly stopped when I saw one of the faces. It was Thomas. I pointed to the photo, my hand shaking. Who's that? I asked the waitress. She turned to look, then smiled. Oh, that's an old photo from World War II. Those boys were from around here. They trained at the base just outside town before they shipped out. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. What happened to them? Her smile faded. Most of them didn't make it back, she said softly. That one there, she pointed to Thomas. He was killed in action. Poor kid, he was only 19. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. The waitress must have noticed the look on my face because she reached out and touched my arm. You okay, hon? I nodded, though I was far from okay. Yeah, I said. Just tired. I finished my coffee in silence, my mind reeling. When I finally left the diner, the storm had passed and the sky was clear. I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the stars, and whispered a quiet thank you to Thomas. I didn't know how or why he'd chosen me, but I was grateful. Grateful that I'd been able to help him, even in some small way. As I climbed back into my truck and started the engine, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. Thomas had gotten home, and in a way, so had I. The night air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. The crackling campfire cast flickering orange and yellow light across the clearing, its warmth a welcome relief from the encroaching chill of the forest. The campers, a group of 6, huddled around the fire, their laughter and voices mixing with the occasional snap of dry wood breaking in the flames. Mark, the self-appointed leader of the group, leaned back against a log, swatting at the mosquitoes buzzing around his face. His girlfriend Sarah sat next to him, wrapped in a thick blanket. The others, Tom, Rachel, Ben, and Emily, sat scattered around the fire, enjoying the calm and peaceful night. Everything felt right. like one of those perfect nights that people would remember fondly for years to come. That was until something moved just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, no one noticed. It was subtle, a shift in the darkness that seemed out of place, something that didn't quite belong to the rhythm of the night. Then Sarah noticed it. Her eyes narrowed as she stared into the darkened trees just beyond the fire's warmth. There, at the edge of the shadows, a figure stood motionless. It wasn't exactly a man, but it was something else. Tall and impossibly still. "Do you guys see that?" Sarah whispered, leaning toward Mark. He followed her gaze but saw nothing. The shadows were dense and thick at the edge of the light, but no one could make out any specific shapes beyond the flickering firelight. "I don't see anything, babe. Probably just a trick of the light," Mark shrugged, trying to ease her growing anxiety. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. Something was watching them. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a sudden, overpowering chill run down her spine. The kind that made her want to bolt from the camp and never look back. She wasn't the only one who felt it, though. Rachel, sitting across from Sarah, tilted her head slightly, frowning. "I thought I saw something too, just there." She pointed toward the same spot Sarah had been staring at. Tom stood up, brushing off his jeans. "Maybe it's just some wildlife, deer or something," he said, trying to dismiss the feeling of unease hanging in the air. But his voice was shaking, just a little. "Maybe," Mark agreed, "but we should probably check it out. Make sure it's not a bear or something." The others agreed, and despite their nervous glances, they all stood up together. Emily grabbed a flashlight and swung its beam toward the edge of the shadows, but the figure was no longer there. The light scanned the trees, casting long, eerie shapes across the forest floor. Nothing moved. The woods were silent. "See? Nothing," Mark said, trying to sound confident. But Sarah shook her head. "No, it was there. I swear it was standing right there. And I don't know. I don't feel right about it." Ben, the most skeptical of the group, scoffed. "Sarah, you're just spooked. It's fine." They all began walking cautiously toward the spot where Sarah had seen the figure. The beam of the flashlight cut through the night, illuminating tree trunks and underbrush. But as they approached, the feeling of being watched only intensified. It wasn't just the presence of something nearby. It was as if the very trees themselves were holding their breath, the forest silent, as if waiting. And then it happened. "Did you hear that?" Rachel suddenly asked, her voice trembling. Everyone froze. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, a whisper. It wasn't a sound carried by the wind or the usual rustling of the forest. It was a voice, a human voice, but it didn't come from any of them. "Get back to the fire," it whispered, clear and chilling. "You're not supposed to be here." The group's blood ran cold. "Did anyone else hear that?" Emily's voice cracked. "I did," Ben whispered, his earlier skepticism gone, replaced by unease. His eyes darted nervously around the trees. They turned back toward the campfire, but the moment they started walking, the whisper came again. This time, it was louder, clearer. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have come back." The group scrambled back toward the fire, now feeling the oppressive weight of something much darker pressing in around them. It was as if the night had closed in around them, the shadows growing deeper with every step. When they reached the fire, they paused. The crackling of the flames was now the loudest sound in the clearing, but it felt wrong. The warmth of the fire did nothing to ease the fear, creeping into their bones. The shadows beyond the light had deepened, and though they could see the trees, nothing moved. Then it happened again. A figure appeared, just beyond the firelight, tall and thin, like a shadow carved from the darkness. It stood unmoving, its outline barely perceptible, as if the night itself were cloaking it. "Who are you?" Rachel called out, her voice trembling, though she couldn't tear her eyes away from the shape. It was like staring at a void, an absence in the darkness that shouldn't exist. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, either, but they could all feel it. The air was heavy, as if the world had come to a halt. No breeze stirred the trees, no sounds echoed from the distant woods. Only the figure watching them. "Let's leave, now," Mark said, his voice low and shaky, stepping backward. But the figure didn't let them leave. No matter how much they shifted, trying to find a safe way to retreat, the figure stayed just beyond the firelight, never letting them catch a full glimpse. No matter which direction they turned, it seemed to stay in the corner of their vision, out of reach, but always watching, always there. They turned their heads in unison, trying to follow its movements, but each time they looked back at the fire, the figure stayed hidden just out of view. Why? Why is it doing this? Emily whispered. Suddenly the air grew colder, so much colder, as though the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. Then they heard it again, a voice, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a mocking mimic of their own voices. "Mark, Mark," it called, in the exact same tone as his voice. The mocking laughter that followed chilled them to the bone. "Ben, Ben," it mimicked again, the voice distorted, hollow. And then each of their names was repeated, one by one, each voice sharp and distorted. Sarah could feel the blood drain from her face. It's us. It's using our voices against us." The figure stepped forward, and this time it didn't stay hidden. A tall, gaunt form emerged from the shadows, its long limbs moving in jerking, unnatural motions. It wasn't entirely human. Its skin stretched too tight over its bones, pale and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface like blue threads of ice. Its face was featureless, except for hollow, deep-set eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It looked like a corpse, an abomination, but its voice, so eerily familiar, was what made the blood run cold in their veins. It stepped fully into the firelight, and as it did, a gasp of horror escaped from Sarah's lips. It was wearing a face. Their faces! Each of them, stretched and twisted like a grotesque mask, their eyes empty and hollow, and their mouths contorted into twisted smiles. "Why are you doing this?" Mark shouted, backing away, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, studying them with those hollow, unblinking eyes, and then it smiled, a slow, grotesque smile that showed too many sharp teeth. It spoke again, this time in a voice that was all their voices, speaking as one. "You should never have come here. You should never have come back." And with that, it lunged. The group scattered, screaming, but there was nowhere to run. No way to escape the shadow that had now fully emerged into the firelight, its presence consuming the night. They would never be seen again. And the forest would remain quiet, unforgiving, silent, until the next group of campers made the same mistake.